Welcome, everyone. It's the top of the hour, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Susan Stewart. I'm the project manager for the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project, commonly known as SPP-TAP. I'd like for you to share in chat your name and your organization so we know who is here. And this webinar, Targeted Universalism, Addressing Racial Disproportionality by Reimagining MTSS, is brought to you by SPP-TAP, with funding from the California Department of Education Special Education Division through a contract with Napa County Office of Education. We're really excited about this topic and we can't wait to jump into it, but first we have a few logistics to share with you. This webinar is built on a lot of engagement. So the presenters have some great information that they're going to share with you, and they have some thought-provoking questions for you. So please be ready to share your thoughts via chat. And we do want to hear from you throughout this webinar, even when the presenters have not asked you to respond to a specific question. So feel free to use the chat box throughout our time together. Kiana is going to gather your questions, and then there will be 3 or so Q&A periods where our presenters will be responding to your questions. So be sure to use the drop-down menu in chat. We want you to select all panelists and attendees, or everyone. I'm not sure exactly what it says on your end, but that way, if you select it so that everyone can see, then we can see everyone can see your questions and comments. We really like to have that shared experience. The presenters will be demoing an activity that you can use with your colleagues. So towards the end, they're going to ask you to read a small portion of a resource. So it's a really good one, so don't skip out on that activity. They're only going to ask you to read for about 5 minutes and then provide some feedback in chat. So don't skip out early if you can help it. I think you'll enjoy the activity and it'll be good for preparing for something to do with your colleagues. There also will be a poll at the end of the webinar asking for your feedback, so please keep an eye out for that. We really use that information, so hopefully you'll give us a chance to hear from you on that. Last, the logistics is I want you to know that we record our webinars so that they can be a part of our project's learning library. So we have started the recording, and it will be available in a few weeks to you or any of those who registered and were not able to join us. We all know that racial disproportionality, whether it's in special education referrals or disciplinary actions, continues to plague our schools, and that the multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS, seems like it's well positioned to address the systemic nature of racial disproportionality. Our presenters, however, will share research study findings that show that current MTS implementation takes a culturally evasive approach to building and aligning systems, really missing an opportunity to move that needle on racial disproportionality. And they propose an alternative, a culturally inclusive MTSS framework, as well as they're going to provide some resources and tools for educators who are working to address the root causes of racial disproportionality, and also to build school systems that center and celebrate students' race and cultural backgrounds. I'm delighted to introduce our presenters to you. And the first is Dr. Seenae Chong. She is an assistant professor in organizations and leadership at University of San Francisco School of Education. And her research focuses broadly on the relationship between schools and communities, drawing from her relationship with young people and their families and the work as a special education teacher and as an after-school provider. Dr. Danfeng Koon is an associate professor and the faculty co-director of the Transformative School Leadership Program at the University of San Francisco. Her research focuses on educational law and policy, and her commitment to improve public education is informed by her previous work as a teacher, a school leader, and advocate, and by her role as a parent of 2 public school students. Izamar Ortiz-Gonzalez is a former high school teacher and a PhD candidate at the University of California, Davis under school organization and policy emphasis, and her research focuses around the retention of teachers of color. And Cecilia Jordan is a doctoral student in the Educational Policy and Planning program at the University of Texas at Austin. Cecilia's work as a researcher is deeply rooted in community and is also influenced by her experiences as a Black queer woman and the injustices she's witnessed as an educator and a restorative justice practitioner. Cecilia, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Hey, so delighted to be with you all today. Welcome. We want to just first begin with many thanks to SPP and TAP for hosting us today. We know this has been a long time coming for all of us and really just wanted to go over what we hope to achieve today. So more than anything, we hope to make you curious and excited about the potential of a targeted universal MTSS for addressing racial disproportionality. And we hope more than anything at the end of this, you're excited to return to your teams and start this new initiative. I'm going to toss it off to Seenae. Thank you.
Susan has already introduced us, but I wanted to share a little bit more of our context and background. The four of us here today are part of a larger multi-institutional research team that's been studying disproportionality in California schools for over 5 years, particularly focusing on school climate and culture. I think one of the greatest assets of our research team is that we are researchers who are also, as you heard, former teachers, school leaders, and community organizers. So our research and recommendations are really rooted in these personal and professional histories and perspectives. So now on to what we'll be doing together here today. We've included several opportunities during the webinar for you to ask questions, and it'll be helpful if you can hold your questions for these times. We'll share a little bit more about the research we're drawing from for this webinar. We'll highlight research findings that point to how current approaches to MTSS may not be adequate to address disproportionality. And at that point, we'll hold for a brief Q&A. Then we'll introduce the concept of targeted universalism as a way to reimagine a culturally and racially inclusive MTSS, which will be followed by another Q&A. We'll make these concepts more concrete through implementation recommendations, and then end with resources for you to bring back to your districts and schools, as well as a final Q&A session. But we're going to begin first with Cecilia grounding us in our why.
Word. Back again, y'all. So we're going to take a moment to center ourselves. I know you all are coming from different places in the state and in your busy days and doing this during your lunch break as you're multitasking. So if you can just take a moment, take some deep breaths in and look at this picture and imagine what a just education future might look like, sound like, feel like, taste like, smell like. I use all of these sensory words to evoke a sentiment of an education that acknowledges the multiple intelligence of young people and the possibility of a school system that targets each student's unique needs. Just take a moment, maybe do another little exhale, move around, center yourself, shake it out. Yeah, and so now I'm gonna have you, I'm gonna give you a little moment more because I need a little bit more. Now looking at this picture, I'm gonna give you a moment to think about what does it bring up for you? And remember, there are no wrong answers. Just like looking at like the different things that you see, what does it bring up with you in terms of education? And I'll be reading out answers as they fall into the chat. Togetherness, community, inclusiveness, happiness, intergenerational. Everybody's in a space where they belong, diversity, slowing down. Everyone is growing and thriving, happy, joy, collaboration. Yeah, exactly. I see a lot of happiness, like, and belonging and community and exploration. And when I also think of feelings of belonging. When I look at this picture, I see folks of all different abilities being able to come together to enjoy the same space. And I think this connects to our larger goals of a culturally inclusive MTSS, because we want to help to cultivate school communities where every child has the opportunity to thrive and to contribute to our society for better. And I see, like this last person said, where everyone can have access. So thank you all so much for participating. And I'm going to kick it off to Izamar.
Hi, everyone. So we will be I'm sorry. So we will first be sharing some of the findings from our most recent study, the implementation of MTSS from the 2021 to 2023. Our study of MTSS came from our research of 4 focal schools throughout California, and these schools were in different phases of MTSS implementation. So we drew on interviews of teachers and school administrators, counselors, librarians, and staff. Alongside the interviews, we conducted classroom observations, and these were whole day observations of school procedures and routines from the perspective of students. We also drew in student focus groups between 4 to 5 students, and we were intentional about requesting a diverse set of students from those that are considered student leaders and those that were considered, or those that were facing disciplinarian issues. And then lastly, we relied on artifact analysis, and we looked at school websites, handbooks, and hallway posters to understand the context of the school. And now, so what our research found was that MTSS as a policy and through implementation was set up in culturally evasive ways. And what we mean by culturally evasive is that there wasn't an explicit or an intentional focus on race and culture, either in policy or implementation. So in talking to educators and school leaders in various phases of MTSS implementation, we identified the following key issues. So for districts and schools that began MTSS implementation during the pandemic, participants became MTSS certified through a self-paced online training platform. Now, the creation of this virtual format for professional learning around MTSS was a stopgap measure during the pandemic shutdown. However, in our analysis of the training content of the online platform, we found that race and culture were only referenced during one module on culturally sustaining and relevant pedagogies. Racial disproportionality has deep roots, and research shows that many teachers need a lot of support simply feeling comfortable thinking and talking about race, let alone implementing culturally sustaining pedagogies. So instead, we found that the platform structured learning as basically downloading a lot of information on many different topics, emphasizing breadth over depth. And simply knowing the term culturally sustaining pedagogies is not the same as having the time and resources to really learn and practice it. Additionally, the content that was the same for all teachers, so raising important differences in teacher knowledge and experience, which is relevant for how MTSS unfolds in the school. So for instance, to understand the role in implementing MTSS, a first-year teacher needs to learn about different topics as compared to a teacher in their 10th year, or similarly, a middle school RSP teacher needs different information than a second grade classroom teacher or a high school AP chemistry teacher. Now, we cannot expect MTSS to address racial disproportionality when the primary training is around it offers minimal support for educators to think about race, ethnicity, and culture. So we also found that people understood MTSS as primarily adding more programs and activities to address individual students' behavior and emotional needs. While teachers didn't doubt that each individual program had its merits, adding more and more programs wore people out as they felt like they were adding another thing onto their plate, thereby straining existing staff resources. Furthermore, it was unclear to teachers how all of these different programs work together to address the root of the problem. Also important, the problem that MTSS was supposed to address was never framed as having racial or cultural dimensions, but in terms of giving each individual student what they needed. So in relation to MTSS, there was very little discussion of racial patterns of the students who were being identified with emotional or behavioral needs. And we found one of the main reasons for this tendency to just add more and more programs was a sense of pressure around accomplishing the output of implementation over the process. So implementation became something to complete rather than a process by which MTSS could change how adults think about and address students' well-being, particularly through the lens of racial patterns. So we also found that implementing top-down did not build educator investment, curiosity, or excitement. This is particularly important because understanding how racial disproportionality is expressed in a school or district cannot be separated from the historical, social, political, and economic realities of the school and the district. So implementing top-down ignores the experiences of people who have firsthand knowledge and are working and living in these neighborhoods and communities. So we believe these issues in the policy and implementation resulted in a culturally evasive MTSS, which limits the extent to which MTSS in these forms can address racial disproportionality. And Seenae will now concretize this a bit more for us.
So when folks think of MTSS, oftentimes organizing student supports and interventions into a tiered system like this pyramid comes to mind. I was really familiar with a form of this as a special educator, and as a teacher, I really appreciated it because it framed student behavior not as something fixed, but something that I or the school could address, provided we had the right supports, tools, and resources. But let's take a look at this pyramid in light of the findings that Izamar just shared from our research study. When you look at this pyramid, there's nothing about the racial and cultural backgrounds of the young people at the school, nothing that would let us know about the racial demographics of the school. Our research found that while educators and school leaders easily reference students receiving a specific tier of supports and interventions, there was no discussion of dependable racial patterns in who was identified as tier 2 or tier 3, or the ways that schools could better serve these students, even in those districts that were explicitly addressing issues of racial disproportionality. In this way, MTSS is culturally evasive. So I want to take some time to consider how a culturally evasive MTSS might feel to a young person from a historically marginalized background. So when the tier 1 core instructional program doesn't incorporate or reflect their culture, then this student will think, I don't see myself or my community in the curriculum, on the walls, among the adults, or in the feel of the school. Do I belong? Because tier 1 practices are supposed to be for the whole school community, when these practices erase or minimally or superficially incorporate your culture or background, it tells you you're not a part of this community. And then this young person might push back and act out, which would move them into tier 2. And while these targeted supports might be helpful in one way to the student, in a culturally evasive MTSS, these supports don't necessarily address the fundamental sense that they don't belong. And in fact, a student might think they're being targeted because they don't belong. We heard from students receiving tier 2 supports like check-ins and checkouts. And they said things like, you know, they keep singling me out. I'm being pulled out of class to talk to adults I don't know. I like some of them, but I think I'm different than the other kids. I don't belong. So the student continues to struggle. And as they continue to struggle, they end up being moved into tier 3 for more targeted supports, which uses practices that often physically separate students from the broader whole school community. And then students think, they're bringing my parents in and they're telling me if I don't fix myself, they're going to move me somewhere new. Something's wrong with me and I don't belong. We acknowledge not all students will feel and think this way, but our research suggests that in the context of a culturally evasive MTSS, when students receive more targeted interventions and supports, they often felt more and more excluded, which decreased their sense of belonging in the whole school community. So we're going to pause now for a moment to answer any questions that came up for you about our research. You can go ahead and drop your questions in the chat and take a moment to let you Thanks for your comment, Rochelle, that removal is not a positive experience. I see a question about why top-down district-initiated initiatives didn't work. I think we're saying we'll actually share a little bit more about this when we're talking about the kinds of practices that did work. But what we found is that it felt to the teachers that the teachers didn't have ownership over the process. And they didn't have an opportunity to make sense of it in the local context and conditions of their school. And in that way, they really felt like, you know, they didn't necessarily disagree with the interventions. A lot of them appreciated the interventions and saw that it was meaningful for their young people. But the feeling of something being added to their plate to do, rather than how does this make sense for our school? How does this make sense for our practice? And how does this make sense in the context of our school community? They didn't have that opportunity to really learn about MTSS and what it might mean for their students, their classroom practice, and the broader whole school community. And in that way, a lot of times top-down initiatives felt top down, felt like they were being told what to do, rather than here's an opportunity for you to do something better for your school community. Maybe another question we can ask, we can answer. Oh, there's some great questions about stakeholders. We have some answers about that coming up. And then we have some great questions about, again, targeted supports for students. We have some answers for that coming up as well.
I could answer Margaret's question about whether culture and climate are tier 1. So I do think that in our research, the importance of the tier 1 is both on the behavioral kind of side, the culture and climate side, and also in classroom instruction, right? So how is it that a young person can see themselves, their culture, their ideas, their music, their foods, right, in all aspects of the everyday kind of school life? And so that's, you know, on walls, in the adults in the building at all different levels, right? So counselors, to the people that they see in the hallways, to reading specialists. There's just a range of both the curriculum side and also, right, in the books that are chosen, in the speakers that come in to speak to them. There's just a wide range. And so for our research, we focused on the school climate and culture impacts, but we could not separate it, right, from the actual classroom teaching that was happening. And that's one of the big things, I think, for all of us to hold on to as we're doing this work.
Thanks, Danfeng. I want to quickly answer actually Francisco's question about, did school staff find any of the content in the MTSS courses useful? Folks did find useful aspects, but it was in relation to their own professional histories and backgrounds, right? And so we talked to a lot of teachers, and many, you know, veteran teachers had received professional development, had sought out their own professional development on a lot of these topics, but they were all required to go through the same platform. So again, there wasn't that opportunity, as you suggest, to modify the resources and make it meaningful to the person's own experience and the school context. And we're going to share a little bit more later on about ways to sort of think about using these resources that are available. So we have our list of questions. This is great. We'll continue to answer them later on. But just to reiterate, as a reminder, just to summarize, we want to suggest that culturally evasive MTSS has focused on interventions which can address the unique needs of individual students. But when shifting the problem of practice to racial disproportionality, we have to remember we're not dealing with an intervention problem, but a systemic problem. Danfeng will now dig into what we mean when we say racial disproportionality is a systemic issue.
Thank you, Seenae. So what Seenae and Izamar described in their findings on MTSS implementation is that culturally evasive approaches to MTSS take an individual approach to the problem that often misses the bigger picture. As we know, research shows that race and culture are very real, and they shape life experiences and outcomes across individuals. So to address disproportionality, we argue, we must understand disproportionality differently. We thought about using these photo mosaics as a metaphor. You've probably seen these mosaics where a large number of small photographs are pieced together to make a larger image. When we began thinking about today's presentation, we realized when we as educators talk about disproportionality, oftentimes we understand it very differently depending on where we are in the educational system. For example, as a classroom teacher, perhaps in the little tiny tile that makes up the tip of the child's nose, I would have never thought about my students as a racial proportion. I thought about each young person as a complicated amalgam of their identities, neighborhood, families, friend group, personalities, and whatever was going on for them that day or that week. Within my classroom, within one of these little tiles, I could see each face clearly, and I went about my day trying to do the best I could to respond to the needs of those young people in my classroom, alongside my job and life pressures. But what is more difficult to see within my one tile is that my actions are taken within larger patterns of inequalities in housing, wealth, employment, and treatment in society from people like police, storekeepers, and other educators. So that only when I zoom out can I see how my actions aggregate into a very different image. Similarly, for district administrators and policymakers, you are inundated with data, but often look at disproportionality in siloed categories. So attendance, school suspension, special ed identification, math proficiency, third grade reading scores, etc. And there's a pressure to compare, target, and reduce gaps within your domain or tile. Not until you zoom out to the big picture do you see that disproportionality in special education is just one part of a bigger context that touches and shapes many other tiles. In order to reduce disproportionality or change the picture, everyone in the system needs to be able to agree on the new picture. Zoom in and out, see what others are doing, think about the role they want to play or don't want to play in this picture, and then have the resources to get to work. So the mosaic as a metaphor to understand disproportionality points to the fact that racial disproportionality is systemic. It's rooted in a deep history of policies, practices, and beliefs, but it's also supported in the everyday by individuals, right? What's happening in each of the tiny tiles. The power of MTSS is that it is also systemic. MTSS can be used to create a system of supports that can counter systemic disproportionality. But to do so, MTSS must explicitly recognize systemic racism and be reimagined to be culturally and racially inclusive. Izamar will describe this necessary shift.
So, while the strength of MTSS is that it takes a systemic approach, MTSS implementation has been primarily premised on the idea that the core educational program works even if a dependable number of students are made invisible or excluded by it. Often those that are excluded are those that are at the margins due to race, class, and other social markers. So the result has been an MTSS which focuses on plugging holes with more and more services or fixing children for whom the system does not work. And so Danfeng is going to tell us more about the concept of targeted universalism, which is a design approach that can help us think about how MTSS can reimagine the system to bring all students in.
Thank you. So you may or may not have come across this idea already, but targeted universalism is an approach to policy and practice that helps us to break out of the gridlock and surmount the roadblocks that face many equity policies. The idea was developed by John Powell and disseminated through the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley that promotes this concept in other sectors like health and employment. We've linked a more detailed primer at the bottom of the slide, but I'll try my best to summarize the idea here. They argue that most of our social programs fall into one of two categories. The first are universal programs that are intended for everyone. They are politically more acceptable because the idea is that everyone gets the same thing, but they're expensive and often make existing inequalities worse because they boost everyone up but don't focus on those who have been or continue to be excluded the most. An example of this is Social Security. Or in education, an example might be adopting and implementing a new math curriculum. Even if the math curriculum was imagined to help decrease disproportionality, it's a heavy lift for everyone, and disproportionate outcomes by race, gender, income, etc. still reemerge. Why is this? Research shows that even with new curriculum, the difference in educational opportunities for students with privilege, those who have access to parents with advanced math knowledge, a quiet place to work, fewer household responsibilities, and teachers and peers who treat them automatically as good math students, and those without this privilege still exist. In response, policymakers have attempted to create targeted programs. For example, the laws that govern and create special ed services or affirmative action. Targeted programs are meant to make up for historical and current day inequalities, but are often met with criticisms of unfairness, especially when the targeted group is considered the other. Often, targeted programs also segregate, label, and stigmatize recipients and those who work to provide those targeted programs. So both universal and targeted programs have failed to address many of our most enduring issues like poverty and inequality. While education alone will not make the world equal, we definitely can do our part. So targeted universalism rests at the intersection of these two approaches. Targeted universalism sets a universal goal and uses a range of targeted strategies to redesign systems to meet the needs of those deemed other. These new systems center those who have traditionally been pushed to the margins with a strong belief that what is best for those furthest from opportunity is really best for everyone. So what might it look like to redesign your school's MTSS using targeted universalism as a design strategy? So first, you would set a universal goal. For example, you might set a goal that every child feels like they belong, something that you might measure regularly through school climate or student surveys, or by measures of behaviors that demonstrate a sense of belonging, like attendance. Then, you might convene a team to conduct a self-study, asking first, for whom is this universal goal, this universal aspiration not true? Which groups of children, racially, culturally, socially, do not feel like they belong in your school community? Then, after expanding the team to intentionally include leaders, teachers, educators, students from these most impacted communities, you would then discuss what are the structural barriers in schools and out of schools that impact each of these groups? What are the existing supports? And how would we affirmatively dismantle the barriers and then develop and strengthen the supports for each of the groups? Finally, you would set and fund, appropriately resource, a range of targeted strategies at different tiers of MTSS, infusing the experience, perspectives, and solutions of those furthest from the universal goal. The result is a culturally inclusive, racially inclusive MTSS. What's important in this process is it's not about adopting new interventions and programmatic add-ons. It's about learning from those in the margins, those in the outgroup, how to remake the core educational program, the classroom, the school, the system, to also work for them. We'll describe this in more detail next, but we'll pause here for any burning questions just on this kind of conceptual framework that we've shared. So I think the idea of the flipping the pyramid, I don't know, I can kind of think down, either direction. I think the most important thing, and we'll share more about this, is how do you take those for whom the system doesn't work and help them and support them to help you redesign the entire system, right? And I think sometimes it feels very, it feels huge to imagine this, but what's helpful about an MTSS approach is that you can see that you can build these different, so you keep on doing this process, right, of taking those that, you know, that end up getting identified as tier 3, and then you keep on using what they're telling you about what would work better for them to redesign tier 1, right? And you keep on doing this, but you don't have to have all of the solutions in place immediately, right? We all know that we're in resource-strapped locations. So how do we take their lessons and build pieces at a time? One brick here, one brick there, one brick, you know, and it depends on who's on board at your school or district site, right, to build these systems. But once those systems are in place, you understand how this particular brick works with another one, right? And I think that's how systemic thinking really supports long-term change in institutions. I'm looking at other questions. Yeah, okay, so I'll just take the easy one first. So this is from John Powell. And so he's at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, but he's really kind of thinking about how to redesign social programs and laws and policies in this way. And so it's not something just happening in education, but really an approach to like health policy and housing policy and things like that.
I can take a stab at these if I understand them correctly. And I think what I think about is students who are, one thing that Danfeng, as my professor, really helped me think about is how students, the root cause of deciding to not attend school or like not be a part. And that is a piece of, it is a difficult piece. I worked at a continuation school in West Oakland. And one of the things that we really had to get to the root of is, why were they choosing to not be a part of the picture? And in what ways were we actually creating the conditions that made them feel like they were not valuable to our community? And so really having to figure out, you know, what's going on here and then trying to like have those. And so when we think about like designing a school around that, making sure that there are multiple opportunities for young people to engage with adults, either in small groups and in classroom settings, in like larger group settings, and engage with each other, so that there is something that they're like looking forward to. Because sometimes those larger classroom settings for students who are struggling with belonging, they actually just need more space for one-on-one time with educators. So like those smaller advisory periods, right, that sometimes become this catch-all for all of these other things. They're actually a really great space if there is a small enough community for young people to really, I know that's like a very specific, I was trying to think of a very specific intervention that we put in, but I definitely, if I understand the question correctly, what do we do with young people who have decided this is not a space for me and this is not a space that I am going to be a part of, and so who've kind of experienced push out in a different way, and so how do we bring them back in?
And I think, you know, many of these questions, right, have to be answered and figured out at your sites, right? Because these answers are different depending on where you are. But for example, this question of, and we saw this a lot in our research, right, that you have a lot of young people maybe showing up to school, but they're not going into the classrooms. So why is that? So using a universal or targeted universal approach, you would actually bring together those young people. But not in a like you're in trouble kind of whatever way, but really like, hey, can you help us figure out, like, so you can tell them we're experiencing this as a problem because it causes X, Y, and Z, and it has these ramifications for the district or whatever it is that you want to say, but include them into the, why is this? So why do you come to school and not go to class? And it's very likely that they'll tell you, right, that there's particular things about particular classrooms they actually don't want to go to. And so it's important then that, you know, there's different issues as school leaders, right, for how to address that, but also there's overall structural ways to approach it. So for example, something that we see is missing often is that you may have lots of supports for young people, or you may have more supports for young people that are culturally inclusive outside of classrooms, but oftentimes that entire structure and system is seen as parallel to and not interacting with learning and instruction, right? So how do you bring those two in conversation more so you're actually supporting teachers to create more welcoming spaces? And of course, you know, it's not easy, but I think those are some of the both kind of structural and then specific solutions.
And I see some of the other questions we're actually going to get to in the next slide of like, what are the specifics and brass tacks of this? And thinking about, but I think you all are actually answering each other's questions in the chat too, which is really beautiful, of what does it mean to come together as a community of educators, school leaders, with families to really determine the best solutions for your community, and you know, bringing folks from the margins to the center to collectively, you know, redesign a targeted universal system. I'm actually the next slide. We're going to actually let you all take a moment to think about this for yourself, and then we're going to share some examples we came up with. So if we were to reimagine, imagine a redesigned MTSS that uses targeted universalism and centers those for whom school is currently not working, what might be a tier 1 universal core educational practice? So like, how might you infuse the cultural, racial, and social perspectives of those students into in the margins into a school or district's universal core educational practice? So share 1 or 2 ideas in the chat, and I'll wait a moment, let you all think about that. Word. Keep them coming. I'm gonna give you just a moment. I don't want to start reading them out while y'all in your flow. Word. Yes, these are so amazing, y'all. So I see, like, down to the basic level of like just greeting every student who comes into the building, making sure every student has some kind of human interaction. You know, spreading the welcome mat for all families from before day 1 each school year, not just those who already feel comfortable in school settings. Honoring lived experience, acknowledging cultural months and celebrations with your students. Community circles, restorative practices, sharing immigration stories, mourning circles, co-created youth activities, ensuring that children see themselves reflected in the curriculum, greeting each student and family by name every day, and what are children interested in learning about. And I also saw like coming to students to actually engage with these questions of like what it would look like for this to be a place that you're reflecting in. Ending each day with kind compliments each other, trauma-informed and culturally responsive, get curious, not furious. And, you know, training teachers how to connect positively with all families and build a relationship before negative phone calls home, a big one. And you're just focusing on recognition. So I see you all are already well-trained educators. And these are things that you've already had experiences doing or trying to do at your different school sites. And all of those are amazing. And so when we're thinking about tier 2 or tier 3 practices, what might these look like? How might you infuse the cultural, racial, and social perspective of those in the margin in your in the school or district's targeted supports? what you shared, 1 or 2 ideas in the chat. Word. I see affinity membership groups, BSU, different specific groups or clubs that meet students' needs, 2x10 strategy. I'm not familiar, but I know you all probably are. Small group communities and relational discussion, collaborative problem solving, and bringing the same that you did with the universal strategy to the targeted strategy, right? Making sure all interventions are socially valid and culturally affirming. And then I see also like paying attention to how we transition students and family between schools and grade levels. I think that's an extra, like how do these interventions follow young people? So here are some generic, and you all can keep putting these in the chat. I know Susan is and Jen are taking documentation of these. So here are some generic ideas that we came up with. So what is in each tier of a culturally inclusive MTSS will really depend about who is the furthest away in your community. And that's different for every community. So from our research in many California schools, the students may be indigenous students living on and commuting from tribal lands that they have been historically forced into, or Black students who come from families who migrated to the city from the South for work, but then were left when industries were closed and moved abroad. Or perhaps in your community, there are unaccompanied minors who are living alone and away from their families because their home countries have been made unsafe. So for these students, a tier 1 strategy might look like you all said, centering the history and people and perspectives of the student who compromised the body. And so I think it's really important not just to think about race, but nationality, ethnicity, culture, and language. So like, it's not enough to like focus on Spanish speakers when we have a large influx of Central American Mayan students whose parents, for whom Spanish is their second language, right? So what does it mean to integrate the culture of indigenous communities outside of the US? So making sure that the walls and the aesthetics of the classroom mirror the identities of the student population, and making sure that adults in the roles also, like, these are people I can look up to. And choose, and like you all said, student choice and voice and curriculum, and you all got it for the community building circles. And so a tier 2 practice might look like you all said, building affinity groups, Rasa Club, LGBTQ plus alliances, and making sure that there's webs of trusted peers and adults. So like making sure that you're pairing these young people, if possible, like with the LGBTQ plus alliance, making sure you have a queer teachers who's paired with those young people. And then like when you have larger cultural events, making sure those activities also mirror the identity of the students. And then finally, the tier 3 supports, a really tough one I know, is trying to make sure that the mental health supports also are people that young people can identify with. I know it's like a huge challenge, but it definitely makes a difference on a campus where a student's like, oh no, I connect with this person, we have similar identities. and then having community leaders who act as critical friends for ongoing design and implementation. So, you know, sometimes we are those critical friends when we partner with schools to help them see the things that they might not be seeing. So being open to other folks within the community coming to give you that deep feedback that you're seeking. Thank y'all so much. And last thing, so focusing on those who are furthest away from margins to center and bringing them to center what we do. And so next, I'm going to pass it back to Seenae to keep us going.
Thanks, Cece. So targeted universalism also offers a framework for redesigning implementation practices, like we were kind of talking about here, for a more culturally inclusive MTSS. Thinking about what each tier should offer within a culturally inclusive MTSS, like you just did with Cece in the previous slide, as well as how you'll get there through implementation practices, is necessary for an issue as complicated and systemic as racial disproportionality. So now I'm going to use the targeted universalism framework to reimagine some of our research findings on implementation that Izamar shared earlier, which led to culturally evasive MTSS. So given that targeted universalism reimagines MTSS as a culturally inclusive intervention system that brings in the most marginalized students, it's what we've been saying this whole for the past couple of slides. The best way to do this is to begin from student experience and perspective, particularly those at the margins. In practice, this means having our tier 3 students designing our tier 1 practices. And tier 3 students should design tier 1 practices because they have the most experience with how the current system set up to marginalize, exclude, and push out students like them. In addition, getting qualitative data on tier 3 and tier student experiences that's collected in a comprehensive and systematic manner, much in the same way you're already doing with quantitative data, will be really important to providing a holistic picture of how to move forward in terms of system redesign. So I know a couple of folks had asked a question similar to this, but this is like having consistent student focus groups, right? And gathering that with a trusted adult, gathering that information, you know, so that they don't feel like they did something wrong, but it's really an opportunity for them to share their experience and then translating that into actual policy and practice for the school community, which builds up trust between students and adults in the community. So getting that qualitative data is really important. And then along these lines, I'm sure many of you are already doing this, but making sure that the quantitative data you have is disaggregated to understand the experiences of the most marginalized students. As Cece also noted, it's important to have the right people. And as many of you also noted, it's important to have the right people at the table, right? Because we're designing a system that imagines everyone as belonging. By right people, again, we mean those students from groups that the system currently excludes or marginalizes, connecting back to our first point. But it's also about bringing in these students' parents and developing the kinds of partnerships so that you can co-design MTSS with them, as well as including them in decision-making in all aspects of the schools, in addition to all those events and opportunities you're already having for them to celebrate their children or to volunteer. Part of redesign also means building out what you're doing well, building out what you're already doing well as part of the system. And one way to build on these strengths is to ask questions like, how are we learning about and documenting what we're doing well and the conditions and resources that allow that particular program or approach to flourish? How are you ensuring that what you're doing well is actually working for all? Data collection is a big part of that. And then how do these practices become incorporated into a culturally inclusive MTSS? So rather than redesigning the whole system all at once and trying to focus on every issue, as Danfeng noted earlier, when we think about implementation, we really think about how implementation can facilitate collective faculty learning experiences that build on educator expertise and knowledge. So we suggest reading something short with your faculty or staff to get their curiosity going. And we have some resources that might allow for that. Then developing a homegrown problem of practice that reflects local conditions, strengths, and needs. Experimenting on an approach in small groups and then coming back to discuss learning. And superintendents and administrators in the audience, budgets should account for this resourcing this time off through, resourcing this work through time off, dedicated professional learning days, and stipends. In many ways, what we are advancing here is a learning design approach that many of you are already familiar with. And what we suggest that this approach begins from the premise that policies like MTSS are not simply just mandates to fulfill, but guidelines and inspirations. So policy as inspiration and implementation is really about learning. And this is really important for tackling an issue as complicated and systemic as disproportionality. We know we can't undo racial disproportionality in one fell swoop through top-down mandates or even with a lot of interventions. Rather, as Danfeng discussed earlier with the metaphor of the disproportionality as a mosaic, we have to unlearn old ways of seeing and doing only within our specific little tile. And we need to learn how to also see the whole picture and how we're a part of and contributing to this bigger picture. And so we think of implementation as one of the major opportunities to learn new and different ways of understanding and doing that will disrupt and dislodge the hold of racial disproportionality. Think about what new practices are we going to implement and try out that might shift the big picture of racial disproportionality that ensures all students will feel like they belong. What can we learn about what went well and what needs to still change? And how will we tweak our approach and try again? Because a problem as complicated as racial disproportionality requires significant consistency, time, and resources. So we know that many of you have already started and committed to the long journey of addressing racial disproportionality. So I wanted to give folks an opportunity to reflect. Folks started sharing some really great practices earlier with CC, and to continue that conversation, please drop into the chat an implementation practice in your school or district that uses a targeted universal approach like the ones I've just shared. And in particular, I'm curious, how has this practice increased belonging for students from racial and ethnic groups that are experiencing racial disproportionality in your school or district? Just to repeat, the implementation practices using a targeted universalism approach are Tier 3 students designing Tier 1 practices, beginning from student perspective, having the right people at the table, working from your strengths, collective faculty learning experiences, and implementation as learning. So I'm going to give folks a few minutes just to think about these implementation practices. So I see a really great question about youngest learners. in the chat. And so maybe we can hold that question for the end and make sure that we come back to it. But it would also be great to hear from folks to respond to, I think it was Barbara, if you have ways of engaging our littlest ones, right? Our pre-K, our TK, our kindergartners. From my experience with our early educators, they are incredible at learning what our little ones need. But if other folks have practices, it would be great to hear. So I hear some really great ideas in the chat. This idea of a multidisciplinary team approach sounds really powerful. And then connecting that with the budget. I see that Janice talks about making sure that the budget is discussed maybe with the right people at the table, right? Like who is the budget impacting? Having superintendents, assistant superintendents in the conversation is really important as well. I love the idea of student focus groups to assist with designing tier 1 behavior and wellness supports. That goes along with our tier 3 students design tier 1 practices. I feel like we should make a bumper sticker, like tier 3 students design tier 1 practices for everyone who does MTSS at their school. That would be really great. This idea of having BSU activities designed and implemented by students is really exciting. And then someone is sharing a collaboration between restorative justice and student service coordinators, behaviorists, SEL, teachers on special assignment, to create an environmental checklist for a tool for our educators, which is really exciting. As an educator, it didn't matter how long year I had been teaching, I loved getting a tool to help me sort of rethink and re-see my classroom. So I really appreciate those ideas. That's really great. All right. Well, it's really exciting to hear about all the work you're doing, and we will try to capture some of these great ideas in one way and share them in our resource library. But speaking of resources, Danfeng's going to share some additional resources for you to sustain this work or support you in getting started in something new.
Thank you. So during our research in California schools, examining disproportionality in school discipline, climate, and culture, we created some resources and tools that we think may be helpful to you. So first is the Beyond Suspension Decline website, where we've posted research reports and practitioner tools. These are all live links, so you'll be able to just kind of click on them and access the website later, but Seenae also dropped it into the chat. Of the practitioner tools, so on the right side of this slide, we will dive deeper in a moment into what we call the North Star brief and how to use it to facilitate conversation about reimagining MTSS through a targeted universal approach. We also have a school climate compass activity that can be used to evaluate school climate and culture within a school and facilitate conversations about how to improve. We have a restorative justice implementation guide that kind of collates a bunch of just tips about RJ implementation, and a facilitator's guide for learning more about anti-Black racism and how to humanize education in the fight for Black lives. Finally, we created a resource library on a shared Google Drive that Seenae will drop in the chat also. It has our favorite research, readings, and tools for challenging racial disproportionality. Our report on our findings on MTSS implementation is also in the resource library. Some of these things that we've promised to you in the chat, we will also throw into the resource library, and you will have access to these through the slideshow, through the PDF. Please feel free to use and adapt these materials as you see fit. Just cite original materials so that people can find them for further study. But really for us, as educators, we really feel that things need to be democratized, right? So it's like not to rely just on consultants and what materials they, have access to, but really how do we democratize and make use of all of our materials. Now I'll pass it to Cece to take us through the activity.
Yeah, so we're going to dive deeper into what we call the North Star brief. So this brief is meant to seed conversation about the central question. what might a school designed through targeted universal look, sound, and feel like? So during our research, and when we've shared our findings, many people have asked us, and I think one of you actually asked in the chat, was there a model school that you can point to? So in our research across 34 schools in 17 districts in California, we found parts of really great targeted universal systems of supports that created a sense of belonging, even for those often othered in other settings. But we didn't find any one school that did it all. So we decided to kind of stitch together these best practices across many schools into this brief so that we could imagine what it might look like if we did. So this is a facilitated activity that you can use with the North Star brief. We suggest having a team read the brief in its entirety and then discussing the 4 key questions. What struck with you about about the school that is described here? What aspects of this North Star already exist in your school and district? What is missing? What is the significance of racial disproportionality of what is present or missing? And what can we do about this? So we don't have a ton of time. So we're just going to do a shortened activity, a shortened modeling of this. And we've dropped the link in brief into the link of the brief into the chat. So please give a thumbs up if you're able to open it. I saw that Susan fixed some of the sharing permissions for us earlier and everything. Oh yes, so we have this link. So we're going to be creative and assigned you to read by the birthday month. So hopefully we have all birthdays represented here. So if you're January through April, you're gonna read the built spaced section beginning on page 2. Group 2, you're gonna, from May through August, you're gonna read the teaching and learning section beginning from pages 4 to 6. And then group 3, September through December, you're gonna read student voice, discipline, and adult leadership on pages 6 through 8. So I'm gonna give you all a few minutes to read this. And as you're reading, you're thinking about these questions. What struck you about the school that is described here? And what aspect of the North Star already exists in your school or district? And what might be missing from your school or district? So we're gonna give you like 5 minutes to read. But be quiet now. Yeah. About 1 more minute left. You all are closing out. It's okay if you're not able to finish everything. All right, if you all can go ahead and begin wrapping up. We're gonna jump right on in. Sorry to rush time, makes me so anxious to rush people. So group one, we're gonna start with you all first. So what struck you about the built space that is described here? What aspect of this are already in your district and what is missing? And I'm gonna go ahead and read out some of the examples. And it's okay if not everybody had space to read it. So I saw like the representation of student art, the visual engagement and draw on visual learners. This person shared, my high school has the potential to do so much more murals, more color, more empowering cultural affirmation, sunlight, open space, murals depicting different cultures, open concepts of collaboration, spaces for students to gather, to get support. Students can see them self-represented through the school. I saw, examples of like folks like crowded classrooms not having windows. We know how difficult those can be for us as adults. I saw someone working on building state-of-the-art wellness centers at their 4 comprehensive high schools. And so like thinking about how do you make these spaces that you already have more culturally representatives. And somebody said, it feels like a school whose main purpose is to truly educate and empower every student. Yeah, I really appreciate that. So for group 2, what struck you about the teaching and learning that is described here? What aspects already exist in your school or district and what is missing? We're gonna read some of these out. So ethnic studies. This campus lucky to have an ethnic studies department. Doesn't mean a lot. Coming from Texas, where we're actively erasing these opportunities for justice, and how transformational those spaces are for students. Autonomy over scheduling, knowing students are learning the right things, even if it's not scheduled out, letting learning happen as it comes and giving space for the messiness rather than the shying away from it. Yes, yes, yes. And that can make adults so uncomfortable, but sometimes learning is messy. How the curriculum is related to students' lived experiences and personal histories. It sounds like teachers were actually given time to teach appropriately, inviting student participation and direction in the learning projects. Our teachers are so time limited, they aren't able to establish the foundation to provide this type of learning well. Exactly, and I like how that answer really acknowledged that this is a structural issue, and this means that we need a systemic intervention, not to blame the teachers in the interpersonal level. And I just really wanted to bring that out with that question, with that answer. Collective freedom, more student gets messy and real, ethnic studies, local connections. Sorry, I'm going so quickly over these amazing answers for time. But so our last group, group 3, what struck you about student voice and discipline and adult leadership in the school? What already exists in your school or district, and what is missing? Right, so I see teachers engage with students respectively and with care, even when students are disruptive or off task. I see this person says that their school is detracking all core 4 subjects in their secondary schools, and that is like an amazing feat. And I know you've done a lot of work and you have more work cut out for you. And doing RJ for adults, like making sure that adults are actually able to sit in circle. And I saw also having I feel like I saw somewhere having a professional development mindset, that we are always developing as professional and as humans. So yeah, thank you all for your engagement. I'll read this one last answer. So somebody said empathy interviews for marginalized students in detract classes to see how their sense of belonging is going in the new setting. Exactly. So checking in, we put in this intervention, but is it actually working? And then into professional development, what's missing, what happens when RP does not work, and that things turn punitive for students or teachers and adults. Great questions to be thinking and reflecting on. So in the actual activity, after doing this part, you would move them into a whole group discussion about how cultural inclusion across all different dimensions of a school matter for addressing racial disproportion and brainstorming next step. So I thank you so much for participation in this activity. Despite the shortness, you all gave like super deep, engaging answers that let me know you're really, really thinking about this. So we're gonna open up our final question and answer session and then close out from there. Thank you all so much.
So as we wait for folks to drop in their final questions, I just want to again note that North Star brief is an amalgamation of all these different practices we saw all across California. People noted a lot of conditions, time, funding, politics that might prevent all of this happening at once. But what we're encouraging, we hope that this North Star brief gives you a vision of what's possible and working on one of these things at a time. So thank you.
I think that so the question of the really little ones comes up a lot. And I do think that in the earlier grades, the places that I've seen where things are flourishing the most is that you do have a lot of parent involvement. And I think that the idea that like low-income parents of color just, don't have the time is actually not super, like to me, it's not reflective of necessarily full reality, in that like people also make choices around, right? So people show up to like parties, people show up to community events, people show up for each other when people are like in need. And so I do think that, how do you create that kind of community space that really encourages people to come in? So, so it's like the importance of welcoming people with like food and music and purpose. And, we've had schools that have parents come in regularly to do yard duty and then participate in parent like councils, right, where they can actually support with other decisions around the school is really important. And then we've seen schools that create parent centers. So hiring actually a parent leader, right, who is already like someone that's well connected in the community and well respected, to actually anchor a space at the school that is welcoming, is a place where people can come and gather and talk, that then serves as a way to bring in parents to help you think through more tier 1 MTSS, like kind of culturally inclusive ways of doing tier 1. I don't know if other people have ideas about that.
I did the younger babies, and we also had like just different classes that parents can, kind of like a parent space that parents could participate in, and know your rights. It was an undocumented community, so having like know your rights, just things done by an organizer that they partnered with, so that parents could come in and like know, what do I do in these situations, and just actually creating spaces for parent learning, and figuring out. But I think it's also like knowing what that community needs and then providing those things. And then also just making sure that, basic things like the books and the curriculum mirror the identity of the student population, and like even having opportunities for parents to come in and do read alouds, lots of like show and tells. I did lots of lots of more play-based learning. I realized in the younger ages, like first graders, things get wild there, but I also think it's the first year that we stop playing, right? And I think play and social learning and making sure that those spaces are developmentally appropriate, and that literacy is fun. So like I had stuffed animals that we read, but then I'll probably know these things already, but like puppets, and I did a lot of like cultural studies, and just making sure that even at the younger ages, like in kindergarten, they can learn about the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims, right? They can learn about these things, and they're capable of, so we shouldn't infantilize young people that they can't understand these really complex world issues, because they're facing them much younger than, and actually some people like, oh, we're adultifying them, like, but we're adultifying them when we're not actually honoring their experiences. So last thing, sorry, y'all heard from me a lot. So you're closing out, share out. If you could just drop into chat one takeaway and one next step. So our point was made. Tier 3 students design, Tier 1 practices, bumper sticker coming. Yes, I'm so glad. I know we said it a lot, but we really wanted to bring that point home. Empathy interviews 11th and 12th grade students in classes that we are attempting to redesign. I saw someone say, reimagine, culturally analyzing the MTSS strategies that they already have in place. And lots of analyzing your own school and just getting a landscape analysis for where we are and where we're going. Thank y'all so much for your time.
Just want to thank everyone again so much for sharing your lunchtime with us. We're really deeply grateful for the work that everyone's already doing to address racial disproportionality, and really excited about how these next steps shared in the chat will further your work with young people, their families, and their communities. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Seenae, Danfeng, Izamar, and Cecilia. You set the conditions for a lot of really great learning and sharing today, and really appreciate having that example of that North Star document. We don't necessarily see it all happening in one place, but you've collected examples of things across California, little steps that can be taken towards that vision. And also thank you to all of you who participated today. It may have been a webinar, but you were engaged, you had questions, you had thoughts, you were sharing. It was very you were very responsive to the presenters, and I'm grateful for your attention to that. We do have a survey that's going to pop up in just a second. We utilize the feedback that we get from participants really to inform our content as well as the format of our webinar. So please tell us what works, what we could do better, what else you'd like to hear about. And I would like to just leave you with some information about how you can contact the California Department of Education and also those of us here at SPP-TAP. Please feel free to give us a contact. If you have a question that didn't get answered, and you'd like someone from the presenter group to answer it, send it to me at slstewart@napacoe.org, and I will get it to the right person. And again, thank you for staying with us today. We'll leave the room open for a little bit longer so that you'll have a chance to fill out that survey. And we wish you a wonderful day. Thank you all.